While Alexander Fleming won the Nobel Prize and worldwide fame, the man who actually saved 200 million lives with penicillin died broke and forgotten. His name was Howard Florey, and this is the story history tried to bury. Welcome to History Snapshots. This is the story of the forgotten engineer who changed medicine forever. In September 1928, Alexander Fleming returned from vacation to his cluttered laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London and noticed something peculiar. A petri dish contaminated with mold had killed the bacteria surrounding it. Fleming called it penicillin, published a paper, and then essentially abandoned the discovery. For 11 years, penicillin remained nothing more than a laboratory curiosity, a footnote in medical journals that few bothered to read. The mold could kill bacteria in a dish, certainly, but Fleming had no idea how to purify it, produce it in meaningful quantities, or turn it into actual medicine that could save human lives. Enter Howard Walter Florey, born in Adelaide, Australia in 1898, the son of a boot manufacturer. Florey was a different breed of scientist entirely. Where Fleming was a bacteriologist content with observation, Florey was a pathologist obsessed with application. He studied at Oxford on a Rhodes Scholarship, trained in Cambridge in the United States, and by 1935 had become the professor of pathology at Oxford University. He wasn't interested in making discoveries that looked impressive in academic papers. Florey wanted to save lives, and he had the engineering mind to figure out how. In 1938, Florey assembled a team that would change history, though none of them knew it yet. His most crucial recruit was Ernst Boris Chain, a Jewish biochemist who had fled Nazi Germany in 1933. Chain was brilliant, temperamental, and possessed the chemical expertise Florey lacked. Together, they began systematically investigating antibacterial agents, and in 1939, they stumbled upon Fleming's forgotten penicillin paper buried in the medical literature. What Florey and Chain accomplished between 1939 and 1941 was nothing short of miraculous. They didn't just rediscover penicillin, they reinvented it entirely. Fleming's mold produced penicillin in such tiny quantities that it was medically useless. The substance was unstable, difficult to extract, and broke down almost immediately. Chain developed a freeze-drying technique that preserved the penicillin, while Florey designed extraction methods that could purify it from the mold broth. By May 1940, they had enough purified penicillin to test on mice. The experiment was elegant in its simplicity. 8 mice were injected with lethal doses of Streptococcus bacteria. 4 received penicillin. 4 received nothing. By the next morning, the 4 untreated mice were dead. The 4 treated mice were alive and healthy, scurrying around their cages as if nothing had happened. It was one of the most significant moments in medical history, witnessed by a handful of people in a cramped Oxford laboratory while Nazi bombs fell on London. But mice are not men. The first human trial came in February 1941. Albert Alexander, a 43-year-old police constable, had scratched his face on a rose thorn. The scratch became infected. The infection spread. By the time he reached Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford, Alexander was dying. Abscesses covered his head, his lungs were infected, and doctors had already removed one eye. He had perhaps days to live. Florey administered every drop of purified penicillin they had managed to produce. The results were staggering. Within 24 hours, Alexander's fever dropped, his appetite returned, the abscesses began to heal. For 5 days, he improved dramatically. Then, the penicillin ran out. Florey's team had even filtered the patient's urine to reclaim and reuse excreted penicillin, but it wasn't enough. Without the drug, Alexander's infection roared back. He died on March 15, 1941. The experiment was simultaneously a triumph and a tragedy. Penicillin worked. It worked spectacularly. But Florey could barely produce enough to treat one patient, let alone the millions who needed it. Britain in 1941 was fighting for survival. German U-boats prowled the Atlantic. The Luftwaffe bombed British cities nightly. Every factory, every resource, every ounce of industrial capacity was devoted to the war effort. There was simply no way to mass-produce an experimental drug that required complex fermentation processes and specialized equipment. Florey realized that if penicillin was going to save lives, he would have to go to America. In June 1941, Florey and his assistant Norman Heatley flew to the United States carrying a small package of penicillin cultures. Legend says they smeared the mold spores inside their coat linings, a biological insurance policy in case German agents tried to steal or destroy their samples. It sounds like spy fiction, but this was the reality of wartime science. The mold they carried represented humanity's best hope against bacterial infection. In America, Florey faced skepticism and bureaucracy. He met with officials at the Rockefeller Foundation and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He demonstrated penicillin's effectiveness. He showed them the data from the mouse experiments, from Albert Alexander's case, from subsequent patients who had survived infections that would have killed them weeks earlier. Slowly, the Americans began to understand what they were looking at. The breakthrough came at the Northern Regional Research Laboratory in Peoria, Illinois. A researcher named Mary Hunt, who would later be called Moldy Mary, scoured local markets for mold samples. On a summer day in 1943, she brought back a moldy cantaloupe from a Peoria fruit market. The mold on that cantaloupe, Penicillium chrysogenum, produced 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original strain. With American industrial might, improved mold strains, and new deep tank fermentation techniques developed by chemical engineers, penicillin production exploded. By D-Day in June 1944, Allied forces had enough penicillin to treat every wounded soldier who needed it. But here's the question that haunts this story. While American pharmaceutical companies were gearing up for mass production, where was the patent? Where was the financial protection that would make Florey wealthy? Howard Florey made a choice that would define his legacy and destroy his financial future. He refused to patent penicillin. His reasoning was straightforward and, by modern standards, almost incomprehensibly idealistic. Penicillin was too important, he believed. It belonged to humanity, not to any individual or corporation. Patenting a life-saving drug during wartime seemed morally unconscionable. Fleming had made the initial discovery. Florey and his team had made it work. But the idea of profiting from human suffering was anathema to Florey's understanding of medical ethics. Ernst Chain disagreed violently. Chain argued that without patent protection, they would have no control over production quality, no guarantee that pharmaceutical companies would produce penicillin responsibly, and no financial security for the researchers who had made it all possible. The arguments between Florey and Chain grew heated and personal. But Florey was adamant, and as the team leader, his decision was final. No patent. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic for Florey personally. American pharmaceutical companies, Pfizer, Merck, Squibb, made billions of dollars from penicillin production. They patented their specific production processes, their fermentation techniques, their purification methods. They built empires on the foundation Florey had laid, and Florey received nothing. Not a percentage, not royalties, not even meaningful recognition. By 1945, penicillin was saving 15% of Allied soldiers who would have died from infected wounds in previous wars. Civilian applications followed immediately. Pneumonia, once a death sentence, became treatable. Syphilis, gonorrhea, scarlet fever, meningitis, bacterial infections that had killed millions throughout human history were suddenly curable. Penicillin changed human life expectancy more than any other single medical intervention in the 20th century. And Howard Florey, the man who made it happen, returned to his professorship at Oxford on a modest academic salary. He continued his research. He trained students, he published papers, he lived comfortably but not lavishly in a world that had already begun to forget his name. In 1945, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded for penicillin. 3 men shared it: Alexander Fleming, Howard Florey, and Ernst Boris Chain. It should have been Florey's moment of recognition, the acknowledgement that his engineering genius had transformed Fleming's laboratory curiosity into the most important drug in human history. Instead, the Nobel Prize became the mechanism of his erasure. The press loved Fleming. He was photogenic, charming, and told a wonderful story about accidental discovery and scientific serendipity. Fleming gave interviews. He appeared in newsreels. He traveled the world accepting honors and accolades. The narrative that formed in the public imagination was simple and wrong. Fleming discovered penicillin, and penicillin saved millions. Florey's role was reduced to a footnote, if it was mentioned at all. Florey himself bore some responsibility for this. He was intensely private, uncomfortable with publicity, and believed that good science spoke for itself. He gave few interviews. He avoided the spotlight. He returned to Oxford and his research, assuming that history would eventually recognize the truth. History did not. By the 1950s, school children around the world learned about Alexander Fleming and his moldy petri dish. They learned nothing about Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, Norman Heatley, or Mary Hunt. The complex collaborative reality of penicillin's development was compressed into a simple story about one man's lucky accident. Fleming became a knight and a global celebrity. Florey received honors too. He was knighted in 1944, made a baron in 1965, and served as president of the Royal Society. But outside academic circles, he remained virtually unknown. The financial disparity was even more stark. Fleming, despite not patenting penicillin himself, benefited from consulting fees, speaking engagements, and positions with pharmaceutical companies. Florey had his Oxford salary and nothing more. When Florey died in 1968 from a heart attack at age 69, his estate was modest. Not penniless in the absolute sense, he wasn't destitute, but shockingly small for a man who had saved an estimated 200 million lives. No great fortune, no pharmaceutical empire, just a professor's pension and a largely forgotten name. How does a man save 200 million lives and die without wealth or fame? Today, if you ask people who invented penicillin, 99 out of 100 will say Alexander Fleming. If you mention Howard Florey, you'll get blank stares. This historical amnesia tells us something uncomfortable about how we remember innovation. We prefer simple stories about lone geniuses having eureka moments. We're less interested in the messy, collaborative reality of engineering and implementation. Fleming's accidental discovery makes a better story than Florey's years of systematic experimentation, problem-solving, and engineering brilliance. But the truth is more important than the story. Fleming discovered penicillin and did virtually nothing with it for 11 years. Florey took that discovery and turned it into medicine. He solved the purification problem. He designed the extraction processes. He organized the clinical trials. He went to America and convinced an entire industrial apparatus to mass-produce a drug that had never been made before. Without Florey, penicillin remains a laboratory curiosity, and 200 million people who lived die instead. The irony is almost unbearable. Florey refused to patent penicillin because he believed it belonged to humanity. He was right, of course. Penicillin does belong to humanity. But humanity forgot him anyway. His idealism cost him fortune and fame both. Perhaps there's a lesson here about the difference between discovery and invention, between finding something and making it work, between the flash of insight and the grinding years of implementation. History loves the flash. It remembers Fleming's moldy petri dish. It forgets Florey's fermentation tanks. In Australia, Florey's home country, there's been some effort at recognition. His face appeared on the Australian $50 note from 1973 to 1995. There's a Florey Institute of Neuroscience and Mental Health in Melbourne. But these are small tributes for a man whose work changed human civilization. Every time you take antibiotics, you're benefiting from Howard Florey's engineering genius. Every time a child survives an ear infection that would have killed them in 1930, that's Florey's legacy. Every soldier who survived a battlefield wound in the last 80 years owes their life, in part to a man they've never heard of. Howard Florey saved 200 million lives, refused to profit from it, and died largely forgotten. History owes him better. We owe him better. The question is whether we're willing to remember.